Now, Shurjo made me feel ancient with that introduction. So
you can correct that.
Okay, no, wait a minute. But I would like. It's been maybe a year or so since I gave discourse here in Mumbai. I don't remember when it was last. But is there anybody here who came to any of our initial Ananda Sangha programs in 2005? I knew he was going to answer it. But I wanted to see if there's anybody else. Now, is there anybody that came in 2006? Well, of course, yoga is good, but 7, 8, 9.
No,
9?
Not in 9.
9? 7? I thought so. I thought, wait a minute, you came before 9. 7. So I have 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Okay, now 12, 13. Okay, now we're getting, now 13, you know, that was significant because that was the year Swami passed. So did you have a chance to meet Swami?
Just after.
Just after, yeah, well that's excellent. Anyway, you can see we've been doing programs here since 2005. Actually, I didn't do the first one that was here, but I did do a program, and I believe it was in December. It was at that temple down there in, do you remember, Yogesh, where that was? It had that really nice Vishnu mandir. Anyway, the murti, but I don't remember the names at all. But anyway, so we've been coming, and it's been my pleasure to be able to have the opportunity over all of these years to come and to share with you. And over the years, we've done many different types of programs, and I think some of the programs we've done are probably ones you've attended, and some other, with perhaps other people doing the taking it, and level 1, level 2. I'd like to know how many are Kriya bonds? Wow, except for 1 or 2 here. That's good. I'm glad to see that many names of people who are Kriya bonds, because I think it was our target audience today for topic that we picked to choose today. We were thinking, what might be a little bit more appropriate. So we picked a topic that is a little bit difficult. You don't know how the audience is going to respond to that topic. But if you have an experienced audience of people who are Kriya bonds, they'll understand it better. But think of the word that we've used here to talk about, renunciation. Now that's not, for most people, a very attractive word. Renunciation. I'm renouncing something. And what conjures up in your mind when you hear that word? You think about rejecting this world and going off perhaps into the mountains or the jungle or some faraway place, and you're renouncing activities and duties and whatnot. And there's this I'm going to take my hearing aids off because they're feeding back on me.
You're talking to
There we go. It ends up sounding extremely loud, and I'm a little hard for me to speak with them. But that word renunciation has this connotation that many people who don't understand exactly what we're speaking about, they say, oh my God, it's like you come to the table and you have this choice of different things at the meal, at the table. And I know when I was a child, you could have, the good things, of course, the dessert, or you could have the bitter spinach. And which one are you going to choose? You're not going to choose the spinach. And for many people, that's what renunciation, the word itself conjures up something that is not attractive. People aren't automatically attracted to it and want to come to it. But we know, those of us who are devotees and who have been on the path a little bit longer, that it's an absolutely critical thing. And you find something interesting taking place with this concept of renunciation as we're going to talk about it today. Remember in the autobiography of a yogi, the levitating saint, he's the one who says, oh, and people had said to him, oh, you're so great. Because he had come into money, he had quite a bit of resources. And they said, oh, you're so great, you've given up so much for your spiritual quest. And then he would just chuckle, because in his mind he says, I'm not the one who's given up anything. I've inherited a whole kingdom of this universe of joy. It's those people who chase after all of those things. They're the real renunciates. They have renounced a world of inner joy for the pursuit of something ephemeral, pursuit of something that's going to pass, which is really something that's an illusion in the sense of it's an illusion, it's a reality in itself, but it gives the illusion that it's going to satisfy what they really want in life. And so in that sense, they've renounced something larger in the pursuit of something smaller. And if we are on the spiritual path for a little bit of time, we come to the realization that that's the step in our spiritual evolution where we come to that step where we realize we're not giving up anything. What we are inheriting is something much greater, in the pursuit of something much greater. It was like you probably had this experience. As I've gotten older, when I was younger, I would like to try to convince other people of my point of view. I think it goes with youth. you know, I'm right. And, you know, you get into arguments and debates, think back of school days, you know, and you got your point of view, and and somebody says something, no, that's not right, you know, and I've noticed in myself, as I've gotten older, I don't try to convince people of anything much anymore. You know, I'm not really even trying to convince you, because I hope you're convinced already. But I don't, people say outlandish things sometimes. If that's what you want, fine with me. I don't care. You know, you're going to make your own choices in life. And people, they make their choices because you can't convince anybody of anything, particularly if they really want something else. I remember I read the autobiography of a yogi, and I was so inspired. My life, it really did change my life. I read that like Swami did, cover to cover almost, over a period of a few days. And immediately I found my life changing from that. Everything sort of proceeded from that. And I was so excited. And I went to my best friend at that time, and I gave him the book. I said, you gotta read this book. This is so fantastic, because we had been proceeding through school together, you know, buddies. And he said, okay, and he took it home. And I saw him, a few days later. I said, well, how'd you like it? Well, I haven't really started yet. Oh, okay. Oh, and then I got a week later, how'd you like it? He says, well, it was on the shelf. You know, he'd gotten into it about maybe 100 pages or so. He says, oh no, it had no impact on him at all. And of course, foolish me, I had to start trying to convince him how he needed to read this, and it was no use. Have you ever given that book to a relative? Have you had something of a similar experience? You can't. They don't. It's in other words, it's almost like destiny. It was meant for some people because as Master said, he put his vibrations into that book, and those people that were magnetically in tune with those vibrations, they resonated with that. And I've come to see that there's really no need. It's not going to do any good for me to try to convince somebody who does not resonate with that book. They have to come to it in their own time. Now, Sadhana Devi and I, We have been center leaders, you know, are trying to, what Giorgio and Narayani are doing here now, we've done this before, and I finally, I was first the center leader in Nevada City. Actually, we had where Nanda's village is close by that city. We had a center there, and I was a leader of that in the town. But later on, Sadhanaji and we went to the East Coast of America, and we ended up at a retreat that we were building there on the East Coast. The work still exists, but the retreat is no longer there. But the work still is prospered. But it came to my mind at that time, we used to try and put out flyers, all the things that they do, and maybe you've helped them do, and maybe you've done it too in your own way. And people would come, but it would always be this trickle of people that would come, or that they would come and I'd never see them again. They were just not that interested, really. They wouldn't last. And I came to the conclusion finally that I had to do this. It was my duty to do this. But really, I didn't think anything I did, those newspaper ads I put out, all of the whatever mailings, I don't know if it really did all that much, because I felt that the people that came and that stuck with us and became Kriya bonds, which there were, disciples, they would have found us. It's like they found us. I didn't find them. They were looking, but it was my job to put up a sign and say, here it is, if you're looking. But I did not convince them to become disciples, or to take up yoga, or to meditate. I just offered a doorway of our center there that they could come. And I think it's the same thing at every place. We can't convince somebody who's not ready to hear what we have to offer, especially on the deep spiritual teaching. They have to come to it themselves. And people, the majority of people, 999 out of 1,000, according to the Gita, are just not interested in certain deep things. Now, peripherally, of course, they will, but to stick with it, to go deep with it. And so if you're Kriya bonds, you've shown that you're interested. But most people don't. But that 1 out of 1,000 that Krishna was talking about has the potential to change this world, to make great changes in this world. Those people that are committed to something. It doesn't take a lot of people. Most people are neutral in life. In other words, they like this, they don't like that. But all said and done, their magnetism is somewhat canceled out. But those people, and especially when a group of people come together who are committed to something, they make a power. And so you as Kriya bonds coming together create a power of magnetism, even though you're just few, 1 out of thousands perhaps, because Mumbai is a big city. Nevertheless, you create that magnetism, and it has a power. And that power is very attractive, and you're going to be able to attract something here. Well, as I said, I don't feel we can convince, I couldn't convince somebody. But especially if I was trying to convince them of the need to renounce. And I realized, even in my efforts, I am going to try to convince somebody because it's my nature. I can't help it. But I've learned that proceeding with renunciation on the front end is not usually the most attractive way, because people don't understand. They're still seeking out there to where they think they're going to find their happiness. And until they exhaust that a little bit, and this is what devotees need to come to. We come to this point in life where we say, I've tried many things in life, and I'm still not finding what it is that I really want in life. And I'll keep trying. But eventually you come to that point where you find, no, that, and those is not working. What is it that I'm really looking for? And this is what Sri Yukteswar says in his Holy Science. If you read, you read the Holy Science at the beginning, he says people, they search and search, but eventually, all souls come to that point where it no longer attracts them anymore. They say, I've tried and I'm not going to find it there. And that what they're saying, what Sri Yukteswar says, is what they really want is they want truth. They want to know what is real. What is the real reality? They become suspicious of this world. It seems to offer everything that's going to fulfill us, but it somehow doesn't quite always measure up. It's a little bit short. And they become suspicious. What is it? What is it? It seems so very solid and real. There's got to be something more, and what is it? And when we come on our spiritual life to that point, not that we have to dislike the world or anything like that. I'm not saying that. But we want something more because it's not fulfilling. It only gives partial of what we really want, and we're unsatisfied. But when we come to that point, then you could say that's when we really begin to enter into the spiritual life. We start to search, and we start to search vigorously and diligently. And the universe, however this works, I don't know how the masters work this in the background, but when that signal goes out, this person is serious. They want something. They want something. Take note. And the universe somehow begins to take note of that and begins to feed you and begins to give you what you're looking for. And your heart begins to seek that. And an interesting thing happens at that point. When that becomes strong, you become naturally disinclined to seek your happiness outside of yourself. It's not something you have to force. You just, you finally, how many gulab jamuns can you eat? And I love gulab jamun, but I find that I have a tolerance level at a certain point. And after a while I say, no, I don't, no more. That's enough. And it's the same thing. We become naturally disinclined and we want something more. And when the soul has gotten to that point, it's like the masters, gurus, God, Divine Mother says, okay, this person wants something more. But it's not, so this in a sense, is renunciation declining those sweets? Yeah, you could say that. But if you're not ready to give up the sweets yet, it's pretty hard. And so, but you have to find, you'll naturally want to give them up when you come to that point in life that says enough of that already. And this is, you saw that movie, The Answer, Herb Jeffries in the movie where he gives that very nice story where Master, he was complaining to Master. He says, people have always told me what I shouldn't do in life. Don't eat gulab jamuns. Don't do this. You eat too many sweets. You smoke cigarettes. You drink. Whatever. And he'd say, well, and Master listened to him. And he says, what should I do? What can I do? And he says, Master asks him, he says, well, do you smoke? He says, yes, I do. Yeah, that's okay. So, of course, now Herb Jeffries, he was a personality, let's say, in Hollywood in those days. And he said, he was surprised. He said, that's okay. He says, well, the Master asked him, well, do you drink alcohol? And Herb wanted to be very honest, and he said, well, yes, I do. And he says, that's okay. And he says, well, do you chase after loose women? And he thought, well, yes, I do. And so Master said, that's okay. That's okay. And now Herb was very confused, you see, because that wasn't what he was expecting a saint like Master to say. But right after he said that last "that's okay," he says, "But I cannot promise you that if you start to practice what I teach you, that you won't want to have those things anymore." You see? Because you have found something better. And so if we talk about renunciation, what really, we're not talking about what we shouldn't do or what we should give up. We should talk about what is going to be the better. What do we really want? Because when we really want something, all the others fall away. And as long as you do want those other things, my experience of looking at people in the world is they're going to go for them. They're going to go for them. People come and ask me for advice lots of times. And while the first thing I always ask people when they ask for my advice, you know, they got to say, "Oh, I really got a problem, and can you give me some advice?" And if it's appropriate, I will say, "Well, do you want advice or are you looking for support?" And usually they're asking for support. They've made a decision in their heart, although they haven't formulated logically yet, but their heart is telling them to do something. And they're looking for support, for me to support their heart's desire. Not to tell them, "No, I don't think that's a good thing to do, go in another direction." And honestly, most people, if they really look at it, they're looking for support, but they'll tell me what they're thinking of doing and I can see they're going in that direction. Now, if it's disaster, you try to kind of get them over here a little bit, but usually the case, I find that it's mostly best to just support people, but at a highest level possible for them, because their heart is made up already. And even if I was to tell them something other, it usually is not going to work. They're going to go in that direction. And it's one of those things I've learned as I've gotten older. People are going to do what they want to do. And it doesn't matter what I say much. Now, and I don't say that always, because there's exceptions to this. But the general rule is the mind will follow the heart. And they'll do what the heart wants. The heart's going to follow and go for. Now, if we're going to talk about renunciation, what we perhaps want to do is encourage people to follow things of the heart that are on a higher level for them. Because if your heart wants God, that's what you're going to go for. And until we get to that point, now we're going to follow many other things. And so how can we translate, you might say, our desire for God onto a level that makes sense for us right now? Sometimes they say, "Oh, I want God, but I really want all these other things." Because their idea of God is so elevated and beyond their ability to even conceptualize. And they end up creating a world dichotomy where God is up here at some level beyond practicality for them. It's an ideal. It's an ideal. And, which is fine, but that which is not God that's the world, that's worldly, and they end up having a very either-or look at the world. I'm either going to God or I'm going to the other place. And it's not like that at all. Life is directional. And so if a person really wants something in life and their heart is yearning for this, for some direction, and perhaps they want to be a monk. I really want to be, but it's not real for them. What they really want is they want to have companionship. They want to be married on some level. They want that life. Well, and to them, perhaps in their mind, it's either or, and this is good, this is bad, and I've failed. Well, no. You have to see what you really want is you don't want to be a monk, you want God. It's God that you want. And you've defined it in this way. But really, that's just your mind defining something in a certain way. You want God. And so if your heart wants to have this, go in this direction and bring God with you into that way. Bring God in that world. Keep your mind on what it is that we really want, which is God. All of us want God. And so how do we bring God into our life? This is what we're looking for. And so when we speak about renunciation, we can't define it in terms of outward form. And this is, I think, historically coming out of Kali Yuga. Kali Yuga has defined renunciation in very outward forms, in certain ways. You do this, you do that, you do not do this, and you do not do that. And it's useful. We do need, life does, we need guidelines. And those guidelines were useful, can be useful, but they're not the definition of what we're doing. Outward guidelines, rules. Yogananda used to say, too many rules kill the spirit. And you have to learn to live by spirit. But the rules can be helpful to get us there. And so we're coming out of an age where people have defined renunciation in ways that are perhaps not useful for us right now. We have to understand it more and more, not by outer form, but renunciation must be understood from inside, what it means inside. And then, in that spirit, how can we then use the outer form, which has its value? See, when we come into a higher age, we don't dismiss Kali Yuga. It had its purpose. And there is elements of Kali Yuga in every age. And so we have to, and so we take the highest octave of it and apply it. So yes, it's good to have guidelines, but not to be defined strictly by those guidelines, because it's by the spirit, so that we have to act in life. And so renunciation is like that, as we find that, yes, it has people still in their minds, they mentally might define it in an old-fashioned way, but we have to come to an understanding that what it really is. And this is why it's not something that normally I would like to talk about to a level 1 student audience, because they're still steeped in realities and impressions that takes too much time to try to dismiss. You have to let a person come into the spiritual life, become a little bit more spiritually mature, and then you begin to look into this a little bit more deeply. Now, renunciation, you could say, let me give you 2 stories of that might illustrate this dichotomy. One is from Swami used to tell one story quite often. He would, when he was in the late 50s, 60s, serving Self-Realization Fellowship when he was in India at that time. He was here for about 3.5 years in India. And he went to, I believe it was Puri. He was introduced to a sadhu there, or met a sadhu, who was reputedly to be 130 years old. Now, obviously, somebody who's 130 has, there's something there. there's something there. So, but this sadhu was a very austere man, very austere. Swami, in his telling of the story, does not give the impression that he was very joyful either, but he was austere. And so Swami was very respectful. I mean, after all, 130s, you have to give, and so he was very respectful. And the man was giving his position. He says, you should not enjoy anything of this world. You must renounce it and not be attached to anything and put it aside. You might say, reject anything of this world. All the obvious outward attachments of life, attractions and attachments. But Swami thought about it a little bit, and he said, well, sir, but what about if I see a beautiful sunset? And the sadhu said, no, even that. Reject, don't allow yourself to be drawn into that, because it's a sensory experience, and sensory experiences are attaching and so on. And Swami didn't say anything. He said, well, I didn't want to disagree. That wouldn't have been proper for me to disagree at that time. But inwardly, he did not agree so much as his comment was, that man was very dry. But there was some truth to that, surely. Certain guidelines there. Now, that's an example of, extreme renunciation, that approach of rejection and, you might say, walling off of oneself from anything that might bind one to the senses, bind one to this world. And the traditional path of renunciation is one of cutting any attachment and burning those attachments up mentally, you might say, burning. And then, of course, that Swami says that's the ochre robes, of course, symbolize that fire of detachment, of burning of desires and attachments. Well, that's a traditional view. Now, the other story to counter that is a story of a woman saint in many centuries ago. You may have heard of her, Rabia al-Basra. And she was well recognized as a saintly Sufi. She was well recognized. And she had her disciples there asking her questions one day. And one of the disciples asked the question, Mother, do you love God? Of course, obvious question, but do you love God? And she says, yes, I do. I love God. I love God. And then the follow-up question, of course, was the real question. The disciple says, do you hate sin? And she says, no, I don't hate sin. My heart is so full of love for God that there is no space left for me to hate anything. And now I thought that was a very nice answer. My heart is so full of love that there is no space left to hate anything, including sin. And now that's an opposite way to look at renunciation. She had renounced, in this case, sin, however that was defined for her. She had renounced that. All of those things that were distracting her from her love for God, she had renounced them. But how? She didn't analyze it out. What she did is she loved God fully, 100%, that nothing else came. There was no room for anything else. As Master said, once you tasted good cheese, you're not going to want stale cheese anymore. And this is something for every devotee who struggles, because we're all subject to temptations, we're all subject to things of this world that are pulling us in distractions in this way, and we struggle with it. And why do we struggle? Well, probably our conscience is guilty because we get caught. and if I'm out in this direction now, and then, oh my God, I did it again. And we struggle with that. But just remind yourself of that. Once you taste good cheese, you're not going to want the stale cheese anymore. And this is how we need to proceed when we think about renunciation. And what is it really? Then we go into this question, what is it that we are renouncing? We're renouncing those things that are, you might say, taking us away from what we really want. But unfortunately, they have a little hook in us still, and they're pulling us in that direction. And so we're trying to build up such a spirit of wanting what it is that we really want, that finally God comes to our aid and helps pull. And you'll see that this is, if you build up your desire for God, your yearning, and respond to that, little by little, those other things begin to fall away. Now, on a deeper level, why is that happening? Because you're building up a certain force. Your heart force, your love force, your devotional force is so strong within you that all of those little eddies of whirlpools of distractions along the side, they just, when the flood comes, Diana always used to use this when she was talking about Kriya Yoga. He says, all those little things along the side, introduce a flood of water and washes them right away. All the little stuff goes. Or Swami, he was complaining once to Paramhansa Yogananda Master. He says, Master, help me overcome my desire for good food. He liked the gulab jamans too, probably. And, and he was fretting about it because, he liked good food, but, and he was wanting to be a monk, eating, rice and gruel or whatever they were eating there. But his master says, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. When ecstasy comes, everything goes. And it's those little, and your desire for sweets is not going to keep you away from ecstasy. It just won't. I guess it's possible, but these are little things, and most things in life are little when you compare. Our job is to put positive energy in a positive direction and focus on that. And this was the position of Swami when he was talking with that man in Puri. And Swami presented through his life a very different vision or very different expression, let's say that, which was a reflection of what Masters was. They expressed renunciation in a new way. Not a new way, nothing's new in this world, but in a modern way. Because there are two sides. And one side maybe was appropriate for one time and for some people in certain situations. But the positive side, represented by Rabia, that side needs to be brought out. And this is what Master, and when he came to the world, in America, to the West, to India, he expressed a new vision of renunciation, which was positive, to focus on the movement upward, contain those things that perhaps are distracting to you, but where is your attention? It's like fear. If you fear something, what's going to happen? Where's your mind? Have you ever had a fear of some sort? And you're always thinking about it. You're always thinking about it. And as you always think about it, you're going to attract it to yourself. You're going to have to face that fear sooner or later, in other words, because you're thinking about it all the time. You're drawing it to you. So where is your mind? We want to be on the positive. And so renunciation has to be looked in that way. Now, let's go to this question of what it is. Renunciation is putting something aside. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do this or that. Break my attachments. But the real renunciation is something inside. And what is it from the yogi's point of view, from the point of view of Master's teachings? When we renunciation, and this is why I also want to speak to you about those of you who are, most of you, Kriyabans. Renunciation, you could say, the act of renouncing something is like a fire ceremony. And Kriya is the fire ceremony, you see. The real fire ceremony is the real overcoming of renunciation. We can burn. Kriya is an act of burning the past. But what we're overcoming when we say we're going to renounce is renouncing that ego attachment. And the ego is defined as the soul identified with the body. The soul is identified with the body. The soul is identified with the senses. The soul is identified with this world as being the ultimate reality. And this is going back to what Sri Yukteswar's reference. When you think this world is the place, the reality, the ultimate substance, it's naturally you're attached to it. And to loosen that, and that's in a sense also a definition of being bound by the ego, that this world, this body, the senses, this is the reality in which I live. The true renunciation is learning to be able to renounce or to give up those attachments of the ego, and to be able to let them go, to transcend the ego, to get rid of the ego, to let it go. And to, once you let that go, the soul naturally rises to something higher. And it's, of course, the whole path of Kriya is learning. Now this is coming, is how do you, or let's say, how do you get rid of the ego? Can you just renounce the ego? I'm going to renounce my ego. I am going to do, I am going to overcome that bondage. Number one, I. How do you do? You're not going to do it like that. You're not going to do it like that. We're bound within the problem itself. And so what Master's teaching has been, what Swami emphasized again and again and again, is we have to learn to transcend the ego. We go beyond it. And this is what defined Swami and Master's approach. And Master defined this philosophically, but you could say, I think Swami put it into practice and is a defining part of his life. He demonstrated through his life of a disciple, a devotee, bound by ego, transcending ego, and how to do that, you could say, is what Swami was about. And you can't just renounce it and I'm not going to be egotic. I'm not going to be an egotist. Try to minimize that ego. And this is the traditional path of minimize the ego. So you go into a monastery. I don't know what they do. I have never, don't know firsthand these things, but there's many exercises that are you might say, to squash your ego, to belittle the ego, to downplay anything that has to do with it. Now, those actually can be good exercises if taken in context of something larger. But if that's all there is to it, I don't know. Is it going to really work? That's the bottom line. Does it work? And I don't believe it probably does. I don't think it does. But what we need to do is we need to, instead of making that ego, squashing it, we need to do something else with our ego. And this is what we are doing as Kriya Yogis on the spiritual path. You could say, this is misunderstood if I say it this way by itself, but you need to expand the ego. Now, if I just was to say it, leave it at that, you'd think, whoa. All those guys in Bollywood, they got expanded egos right there. And I don't quite mean it that way. What I mean is we have to use the ego. And we have to give up the ego. We have to offer that ego. We have to use the ego. We have to use who and what we are for something higher. And so Swami this is what he advised and what he demonstrated in his life. Think of before I go there, think of a service dog, blind dog, not a blind dog, blind person with a dog. And the service dog is very, very well trained. And that's what our ego is. It guides us who are blind. But it has to be well trained, or it can guide us in any old direction. But and it's disciplined. It minds the master. And it takes the master where the master wants to go. And that's what the ego is really. It's just a tool. Our personalities, our talents, all of those things in which we sometimes feel ashamed of, and I wish I wasn't this way or that way. It's who we are. And as you grow in life, and as you get older, you're going to discover something that your personality, you're thinking, if I want to be spiritual in life, I want to be something other than I am now, because I don't really like who I am now, and I need to get rid of it. You're not going to become somebody other than you are now. You won't. But you can refine it. You're going to bring out, you have like a stained glass window, you have a set of characteristics that look a certain way. No soul ever has been exactly like that. You're unique. And like a stained glass window, it can be dirty. It can be muddy. The light doesn't shine through it too well. But you're not going to be changing the pieces of color out of that personality much. Over a long time, I guess wear and tear might take them into a different hue, but you're not going to really change that. What you are going to do is you're going to wash them, to let the light shine through brilliantly into who and what you are. And so all of those qualities are going to be turned into beautiful things at the highest octave. And that's what we do. And there's no need to compare your colors to another person's colors, because they're all beautiful. And you think, oh, I want to be like that. You're not. You're going to be who you are, but at the highest octave, you see. And so to do that, we have to learn to offer up that ego and be able to reach that point when we're able to give it away. Now, how do you do that? Now, some people, this goes according to nature. Some people's natures are best served by being in a reclusive monastic environment, because at a certain point in their evolution, that serves them well. But for most of us who are in the world, we have this personality, and we need to use it, but use it in the best way possible. And that means not letting our desires, our whims, our fancies, our likes and dislikes rule it, but to allow God's energy to flow through this ego and to shine through it. And that means getting everything else out of the way. Let it get out of the way, but we get it out of the way by bringing God into it and filling that jar. You know, you have the image of the jar, it's muddy. You keep pouring water into that jar, letting it overflow. Sooner or later, you're not going to see any mud in that jar anymore. And we have to bring that clear water into that jar. And little by little, we find that the glass becomes and the water becomes clean. And so what Swami did, he lived in a monastery there with Self-Realization Fellowship for many years. But it was an example. He in 1958 he came to India, but then he started the work here. He came with some other renunciates from America, and they left eventually and left him behind to help supervise the work going forward in India and continue to help oversee that. And then he went back to America once or twice during his time in India, but then one time back he came and he had an experience, I believe, first in Australia. He was giving a talk, and the tradition in those days was that they wouldn't advertise in his Self-Realization Fellowship environment, they wouldn't advertise who was giving the talk. It was just, teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda presented by somebody. But they wouldn't. And so he began to experiment when he came through Australia. Then he came back to India, And he found that when he came to India, he was a bit of a personality. He was an oddity, you might say, because he was this, now this is in late 50s, early 60s. American swamis were not very prevalent in those days. So people would say, who is this? You know, and so there people were curious. And because they were curious, they would come. They would come. Now, he was going to give a talk. He was going to give talks, interesting people, to interest people in the life of Paramhansa Yogananda, his teachings. Now, is it serving master to put up a poster that says, a talk on the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda presented by somebody? Or is it more useful to say, presented by Swami Kriyananda, disciple of, you know, with his picture there, which would bring in more people? Well, obviously, when he put his name to it, people will come. Why? Because they're curious. Oh, who is this guy? I want to go. I want to see. And rather than any old buddy. So he began to realize, well, and it had nothing to do with whether he didn't care himself personally, but he used his name and his picture in the service of his guru because it worked. And now Swami always had one thing he told us. He says, you can have lots of good ideas in life, but how do you know if they're any good? Do they work? He says, what works? And so, but what about your picture? Isn't that egoic? And he says, why is it egoic if you're not attached to it? You don't care. It's not. And so consequently, he became quite popular. He had thousands of people coming. Now, of course, people in his organization, egoic. He got a lot of negative criticism for that, because he was putting his name up, drawing, and he must be drawing people to himself. What other reason would he have except to draw himself into the limelight? Well, Swami, he says, I'm just an instrument, and my job is to serve my guru. I got to forget about myself. It's not about me, it's about my guru. Now, that took courage to do that. Now, another person might be self-aggrandizing to do that. But in Swami's case, he didn't care. He wanted to be a hermit when he was all along anyway. But if he began to see that as he said, I've come to see that Kriyananda, talking about himself, I've come to see that Kriyananda is simply an event. Simply an event of which I am responsible. So it's just something happening. It wasn't him. It's just something happening. And he allowed it to go. Now, it took a lot of courage to be able to step back from his ego. At first, it looks like it's ego, but it's really not ego. It's the opposite. Because he ended up, that ultimately ended up in disaster for him, and he was expelled from that organization. But he used his ego, and his point was, if you use what God has given you and are not attached to it, you're allowing the guru to use you, to be an instrument, to serve the guru's work, and something larger can take place through you. And in the process, forget yourself. Forget yourself. Because lots of times in the process of old style renunciation, not this, you're thinking about yourself. And that's what's going to get you into trouble. When you think about yourself, you get attached to it. And you're thinking about me, how do I look? You know, I don't want to look this way because, and you're just obsessing. And you have to, it's all about forgetting yourself. What's, as he would say about humility? People think humility is self-abasement. Oh, don't, and they're thinking, he says, no. Inferiority complex, superiority complex, all of them. They're the same thing. The true humility is learning to forget about yourself and serve. Let the life force flow through you. But in every path there's danger, and you have to keep it under control. But if you keep your mind on the Guru, just say, Guru, you can do this. I want to get out of the way. And he said, this is what Master wanted for Swami. And this is why Master said, all of my other men disciples, now that wasn't quite literally true, except for Saint Lin, have disappointed me. You must not disappoint me. Now he was referring not that they were not good souls. They were good devotees. But none of them took up the mantle of serving Guru's work. And Swami, Master saw in Swami, here's somebody who's willing to let the power, my power, Guru's power, here's somebody who's willing to let my power flow through them and get himself out of the way. Because he said, unfortunately, many other the men disciples let that go through them, but they didn't get themselves out of the way. And that it caused a lot of havoc to the work. And so they disappointed him in that way. So it's not, you can't let it flow through and just let your light shine through that dirty stained glass window. That's no good. But on the other hand, you can't turn the light off either. You've just got to get out of the way and allow it. But you have to let the energy move. And so the way to do that is to serve. I think this is the particular way that we, in this age, at this particular time, have been given in this work. There's room for the hermit, and there's room for the bhaktis, and there's room for all. And we each have a little bit of that in us in some fashion. But all of us can be channels and instruments for the Guru. And to allow the Guru, allow God to flow through you in the highest way possible. And this is how we serve the Guru. And in that, we wash away those individual little egoic tendencies. And this is what and how we should also approach our practice of Kriya. Kriya is, when a person first comes to Kriya, there's a certain tendency of I-ness in there. I'm making some progress. I'm gonna get there, and I'm doing this. That's natural. I mean, that's just how it is. I am doing this Kriya. And that's good for starts. And we should, and you don't want to discourage that, because you want to, the ego needs to be made strong. See, many people think humility is having a weak ego. It's not. It needs to be strong. But then it has to be offered. You have to give it. You give it away. Because then you're having something, a real gift. If you want to give a gift to somebody, do you want to give them a weak thing, or you want to give them a strong thing? You want to give God something strong. That's a real gift. It has some worth to it. Well, I forgot what I was going to say. But anyway, when we're doing our Kriya, so yes, we start off our Kriya. I'm doing this. I'm doing this hard. I'm doing it as best I can. And then as we start to interiorize, we begin to realize that I-ness begins to, of its own accord, it begins to soften. And we realize that as it softens, something, and in our search for truth, when we say, I want to know truth, I really want to know truth, something happens naturally. We begin to attract to ourselves avenues by which we can find that truth. And we begin to attract to ourselves other people who are interested in the same thing we are interested in. Satsang happens naturally through that magnetism. And what also happens, and one of the reasons that begins to happen, is the heart begins to soften and become sensitive and able to love. It begins to open and be able to love. And that love is what allows other people to come into your orbit. Now, as you begin to practice Kriya and you begin to open yourself up to a higher, your energy begins to go up, and your expansion of consciousness begins to happen. Naturally, that sensitivity of the heart will begin to open as well. And you'll begin to attract, love begins to come in. And as that attractive power begins to develop in the heart, the ego side begins to soften also a little bit. Now, when you feel, as you're doing Kriya, you feel and stimulate if you need to. As you feel a sense of self-offering in your practice of Kriya, I don't want those things. I just want you, God. That's the heart beginning to open. At that point, start to very consciously, as you're doing your Kriya, make each Kriya practice an act of self-offering, of I'm offering up this I-ness, I'm offering up this egoic pride, or whatever it might be. I'm offering it up to God. And in the process, you begin to burn those little tendencies that are associated with that consciousness. And you can begin to make just the self-offering, because this is the essence of the spiritual path, is the self-offering of our separation of the little self from God. And little by little, we begin to offer up that ego and all of the qualities. Just, you don't have to think about it specifically. It's not an intellectual. It's not this quality, that quality, but in the emotional or devotional feeling of self-offering of yourself into something higher, and a relaxation of all of the things that are binding you, you'll find that little by little, you'll find yourself being drawn into attunement with that divine flow. And the Guru will reach down and begin to help you. And in time, you begin to achieve that state where you simply forget yourself. You forget your self-consciousness, all those things that are perhaps hiding your true qualities will begin to melt away. And who you really are will begin to start coming forward. And you will begin to shine with those colors and with those lights. And you don't need to compare yourself to anybody else. You are who you are, but you don't need to be proud of it either. There's nothing to be proud of. It just is. There's no pride. Pride comes when, of course, that's an egoic thing, but there's nothing. It just is who it is. And God is going to shine in God's own way, uniquely through each one of us. We just want to be pure instruments. And if you're pure, certain things will naturally express. Now, this little thing, some of you were here for the Kriya Bond meditation. We played this little piece of Swami speaking. He said, one of the qualities of Kriya, particularly, is joy. Joy is induced by the practice of Kriya. Just as Hong Sa stimulates a feeling of peace, Kriya will induce a feeling of joy. But to help that, we need to bring joy into our practice. And if we bring joy into our practice, we'll find that then we begin to experience that joy. We begin to experience it, and it begins to grow within us. Now, so these are, you could say, a couple of sides is taking the positive approach for when we speak about renunciation. It's renouncing our sense of littleness, our sense of limitation, our sense of falseness of who we think we are when we're not that at all, and diving into service of letting the Guru and God flow through you. What does Krishna say? in the Gita, what we're advised to do. I'm not the doer. God is the doer. And this is the teaching of Krishna. And and how Master used to, or Swami Sri Yukteswar said, how we go through various ages, and how in the descending Dwapara Yuga we went into Kali Yuga, and the Gita is from descending Dwapara Yuga, and how Sri Yukteswar said we're now coming into an ascending Dwapara Yuga. And this is why I think resonating with Dwapara Yuga is the Gita, because we're coming that time. And so that's why I think one of the reasons, I don't know this to be so, but I think one of the reasons Master emphasized the Gita so much in this age is because it's a scripture appropriate for this age. Serve, but let it be God who is serving. Nishkam karma, that not be attached. That's the form of renunciation that is appropriate for this way, an embracive one, not a rejecting one. And I think in that we'll find ourselves being uplifted. Now, I'd like to take this, I have until 12:30, and I'm going to stop for questions before we get there. Okay. I wanted to take this into a little bit of practical application. My book. Now, when Swami Kriyananda started Ananda Village, the Ananda Ashram, the Ananda work really, he started that in the 1960s, latter part of the 1960s. And I always found it, Swami, it was in those days when I met Swami in 1968, I found him a little mystifying in some ways. Not that I thought about it deeply, but it was, I was too young to think about it much. But he had two forces moving along at the same time. He had bought a piece of property in the mountains, foothills of the mountains, and he wanted to start what he called a hermitage. That's how I met him, and he had, in a conversation, he talked about this. I thought, wow, a hermitage, that's really sounding neat. He says, yes, for aspiring yogis, we could go up there and we could have this hermitage, and we could just live a very simple life, make some little coutures and live a life of a hermitage. Because he had this idea in his youth of wanting to be a hermit, and having this, been in India and that whole tradition. So I was very attracted to that. I thought, oh, that's great. But at the same time, he was doing that, he also had this momentum. He had written a book about, and he titled it Cooperative Communities, How to Start Them and Why. He was wanting to start a community. And at the time, I thought, well, it was a popular concept and that idea, utopian, like a utopian ideal. But it was obviously, if you're going to have a community, you're going to have all these people. How are you going to have these hermits, and then also have all these people? It seemed very contradictory to me. But now I can reconcile it a little bit, because this idea of communities was something Master wanted. And again, remember I said, as you start to develop, the heart begins to open, and you are attracted to, and you attract to you, people of like mind. It's a natural thing that happens in the soul's evolution. You want to be around people who share those ideals in the heart. And it's not a mental thing, it's a heart thing. And you're pulled to them. So Swamiji was wanting to respond to that by having this community, but yet he wanted a hermitage as well. And so there were always these little bit too. And so at first he had proposed having two very separate things. But as time went on, life was not ordered that way, you might say. Karma was not ordered that way. And the two, he finally came to the conclusion that we needed to somehow bring them together and be able to have a form of a renunciate order. He wanted to start a renunciate order in the midst of a community. And this had certain advantages. At first he thought, well, the renunciate order would be an inspiration to the householders in the community. And then it evolved a little bit further, and he explained that no, this whole community is a renunciate order. Instead of having, and this, you see, it's an evolution from that old way of thinking. You're either a renunciate or you're not a renunciate, defined by outward appearances or outward practices, to one of, wait a minute, that's just continuing something. And what about if we were all renunciates? And that became the basis of this ashram, then this community that we're starting. And then from that point, that idea of starting a community became starting an ashram. And because an ashram is where people come to seek God. And all of us seeking to truly seek God, one needs to be a renunciate, because it's a razor's edge. God and the ego can't walk at the same, on that edge. It's all of us here are part of a sangha who is trying to seek God. So isn't it by default, we're all, those who choose to do that in their life are renunciate. So in a sense, those of you Kriya Bonds, you're renunciates. Now you may not self-identify with that, but that's really what it is about. If you take up the path to Kriya, you are implying, you're saying, this ego, can let it dissolve. Or I'm going to offer this ego as a gift to God. I'm going to turn it over, because God, it's you who is the doer of everything. And so all of us are on this path. So Swami took that, and I say it also to those of you who are Kriya Bonds, all of you have, if you're a Kriya Bond and you've come up to be a Kriya Bond through Ananda Sangha, you have some interest in Ananda as an organization, because this is a tradition that has brought these teachings to you. And so I want to point this out, that we're renunciates. And Ananda Sangha itself is, you might say, an organization of people who are renunciates. But of course, we don't go around and hold up a sign to that. But think of it in those terms. And Swami took it a step further. He took it a step further, and he says those people who really want to be serving, actively serving, we should encourage that. We should have classes in that, of how we actually do transcend this ego. How can we put this ideal of renunciation into action? And this is why we have centers. This is why we have groups and why we encourage the Sangha to come together like this, is to give those of you who have a desire to transcend this ego and have the ability to do it offering outwardly in service to the Guru, gives people, you might say it's the job of the center leaders to find opportunities for you to be able to serve in that way. It's oftentimes, I know in center management, you don't really have anything to do, but you make it up. You make up jobs. Not for the sake of the center, but for the sake of the people who come to the center, so that they can help. Because in the helping, in the doing, it gives us a way to be able to let go of this self-identity, and to be able to serve as part of a larger Sangha and with everybody else. And so so Swamiji put this in motion through his creation of Ananda Sangha, and we began to develop a little bit of, and we really do consider ourselves a renunciate order. And we have, in America, we don't have this so much in India, but in America we have different levels of that, because we're organized enough to do classes and do those sorts of things. But the time is going to come, in an Indian center, we do it in Italy as well, anywhere we have a center like here, sooner or later there's going to be classes. These probably, I'm loading more work on them, but not yet because they got a lot of other things to do too. But sooner or later there's going to be classes of how people can consciously participate in this part of Ananda's work that's part of this renunciate order. And people sometimes ask the question, who, you know, or maybe they don't, the question may arise, who's in charge of this place? I mean, who's in charge of Ananda? How is it organized? Who is the core that keeps it together? And we have various communities, and we have different ashrams in different parts of the world, and people run those ashrams. But the real core of whose responsibility is to maintain the spirit, because organization, they come and go. It's the spirit. It's the responsibility of that group of people who have said, I want to be, you might say, a caretaker for this work and to see it succeed and do Master's work in the world. And those people who have self-identified said, yes, I'm committed to that. That's my commitment. We have a group and we call it our Sevaka order. And this is and in every center there are a group of people who are part of our Sevaka order, and it's their responsibility to keep the spirit high and to keep it steady and to keep it consistent and keep it in tune with everybody else in the Ananda work. Because, you know, as we get bigger, we've got lots of centers everywhere. But every center's responsibility is to keep that same spirit. Now, this makes it interesting because I travel quite a bit. I'm hoping not so much anymore, but I used to travel more than I do now. And I'd go to all different centers around the world. And I'd go into that center and I said, this is just like the center over there. Everybody's on some level the same spirit. And there's, brothers and sisters. And you see this center, that center, and you try it yourself. You go up to Delhi, you go to Bangalore or Chennai, you know, and you'll see, it's very similar. Not the outer form, little variations here and there, but the spirit is the same. And those people in that center who keep that spirit, they are the ones responsible in the long run for keeping Ananda strong. And we actually have an organization of those people, not so much in India, because we're not old enough here yet, but because it takes time. But and those people are what we call members of the Sevaka order, and there's some hundreds of those people. It's not, with thousands of people in Ananda, but that core, and they're sprinkled out. And they've said, it's my job. And we get together once a year, twice a year, some of us, and and Jyotish is the Dharmacharya of that, and he's the only officer of that organization, the Dharmacharya. We're loyal to the vision of Ananda into the future. So that's going to happen here in Mumbai sooner, if you have a stable center. But even if we don't have it in an organized way like we do some of the other places we have, it's your job, those of you who are serious, disciples of Master, Gurubhais, disciples of Master, to carry on the spirit. And that spirit is a spirit of renunciation. Renunciation of that which isn't a part of the real spiritual path. And the process for that is to love God so that there's nothing else. There's no space for anything. Love God, love gurus, and it's not about excluding anything because there's no space for it. No space for it. Now, I wanted to read a little something here from Swami was giving a little bit of all of us too, we also have this Nayaswami order, but it's a different thing. But I think all of us, to some degree, in our spiritual self, are moving on that track too. Because in a sense, that's, you might say, a form of renunciation as well. And I'd like to read some of the qualities that Swamiji says. What are the qualities of somebody who aspires to be a renunciate in that outer form, you might say? Wear blue, you might say. He says, he has in this book, he says, what then are the marks of those who might consider worthy of being accepted as true renunciates in the outer sense? They would be those who have achieved progress, noteworthy progress, toward the attainment of the following virtues. So whether we attain these or not, that's not the point right now. The point is, this is what we're trying to attain. As somebody who takes on an identity of, yes, I'm a renunciate in the path of this Kriya Yoga and in path of Paramhansa Yogananda, they have no or very few attachments or desires. They are without anger. Anger appears in the heart when one's desires are thwarted. So you ever get angry? Work on it. Work on it. They accept without prejudice whatever life gives them and live by the principle, what comes of itself, let it come. Are you able to accept what comes in life? Cheerfully. If it comes of itself, you have choice. They never seek to justify or defend themselves. It's his fault. But her fault. Oh, okay. They accept all judgment by others dispassionately, or as experiences given them by God for their higher good. So, praise and blame, praise and blame. They keep in their hearts primarily the company of God. They are indifferent to others' opinions of them. Now this needs a little qualification. I was about to do a video the other day, and I put my kurta on over my head, and I was sat in front of the camera, and one of the ladies there says, Jaya, my hair was all messed up. She says, you can't go on the camera like that. And she got a comb out and started combing my hair. So I'm indifferent to their others' opinions. Well, yes, no. I didn't really care, but you have to be appropriate. But there was nothing in the heart about it. So you have to do the appropriate thing and act as needed. They work without personal motive to please God alone. They are impersonal in the sense of wanting anything for themselves, but never in the sense of being indifferent to the needs of others. Swami used to have a nice way to say this. He said, because the difference between being personal and being impersonal, you see. He says, when it comes to yourself, be impersonal. But when it comes to other people, be personal, you see. But with yourself, just be neutral, be impersonal. Get rid of likes and dislikes, go beyond those. They see all beings as striving toward the attainment of Satchidananda, ever existing, ever conscious, ever new bliss. They accept nothing as their own, but as only being on loan to them for the benefit of others. Nothing belongs to me. It's going to go anyway, sooner or later. It's coming sooner every day. And so, for all of us. They view pleasure and pain equally as opposite expressions of eternal divine bliss. They have meditated daily for years. Because they're always happy in themselves, they are impervious to insults, outer suffering, failure, defeat, or disaster. They strive to live the ideal that Paramhansa Yogananda voiced when he said, "You should be able to stand unshaken amidst the crash of breaking worlds." And finally, they strive to love God unceasingly and ever more deeply in a spirit of utter openness to be guided by His will. Now, I'm going to stop there and give you a chance to ask questions, if there are any. But for that, I have to put these back in. Now, is there anybody have a question? Comment? Okay, no. It's always hard to get the first question out there. And so let's get somebody I'm going to appoint somebody as the first question.
Jaya, Swami created as part of the Nayaswami order also the pilgrim vow. Can you talk a little bit about that?
The pilgrim, I'm sorry, I forgot, yes. Now, if you, what Swami was saying is we're all pilgrims on this life's journey, making a pilgrimage to a holy place, our true home. And if we see ourselves as a pilgrim is an intentional journey. It's not a haphazard journey, it's something we do intentionally. And if we see ourselves intentionally making this journey, he wrote a vow that was called the Pilgrim's Vow. And it's applicable to anybody. And he wrote this, I'll tell you the circumstances, how this came about, but it's something that we offer from time to time for people. If you agree and feel yourself to be a part of the Sangha, and you feel, yes, my life is a spiritual pilgrimage into higher consciousness, we offer this vow publicly for the public to take from time to time. It came about in a certain way. He, in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, late 2000s. What was it? Yeah, it was 2008 or 9 or somewhere in there. He started. He had been a Swami. He was a Swami. He wore the ochre and the orange robes, and but he began these thoughts about wanting to reorient what Swami, the journey of a Swami is in life, or renunciation as a Swami. He was dissatisfied. He wanted to change that a little bit, and so he wanted to start a new order of Swamis, and which he did, which is called the Nayaswami order of Swamis, and he started that in the late 2000s, and he defined, which is another whole subject, and is the subject of this book, by the way, of the starting of that order and what it meant. And so he created this order of Nayaswamis with various stages along the way: brahmachari, tyagi, Swami, Nayaswami. And he had a first couple initiations where he invited people that had been long serving on the spiritual path to participate in that. And he did the first one in India, 2009 or 10, I don't remember exactly, up in NCR. And so it was a very well-attended event, and people took vows at a certain level. And we had hired a videographer to make a video, a professional videographer to take a professional video at it. And so he did this, he did the vows for each level, and it was a very uplifting, moving event. And at the end of it, the videographer, all these people had taken these vows, And the videographer says, I want to take a vow too. And he was just a guy from, I was a cameraman, and they would come in hired to do the, and he was so inspired, he wanted to do something. So that inspired Swami, he said, well, yeah, we need to have a vow that anybody could take, not just the people that are taking of this in this order. So he said a general vow, because it's the use of a vow is helpful, just like we take a vow when we take Kriya. When we vow, we engage the will. So I will do this. And when you engage the will, you're engaging the will, and you're making a conscious choice. And that element of conscious choice is important. It's not haphazard. It's something, and to the degree that we energize our will, it has power. But even just making it less than powerful, just making that has its own power. So he wrote this pilgrim vow, which is basically for anybody who considers themselves to be a pilgrim on the spiritual path. And we offer that from time to time. I guess we haven't offered it here in quite a bit of time. I imagine it's something that we somewhat overlook, and we shouldn't. And I'm suspecting that Shurja and Narayani are going to offer this sometime in the coming near future. But anyway, they'll be speaking more to you about this. But it's a wonderful vow, and I don't have a copy of it with me. It's not in the book, I don't think. So, but they can make it available to you if you're interested in that. Any other questions? Yes.
See, it's very enlightening, and the talk is very enlightening. See, I have, you talk about to be truly renunciate, you need to give up your lower thing for a higher thing. See, and see God, then you automatically become true renunciate. But there are certain things, some negative emotions. For example, this anger, lust, jealousy, hatred. These, I think one should renunciate also. But tell us how to renunciate this.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, what you're asking is, what is the spiritual path? What is it about? Let's take anger, for example. I just used that, and I think you mentioned anger. Lower for the higher. How do you give up anger? It's like the person who was in the desert, and Paramhansa Yogananda saw this fellow in the desert, and he was very disheveled and dirty clothing. His hair was unkempt, and he was just a dirty Tomasic type of fellow. And Yogananda saw him, and the fellow said very proudly to him, "I am a renunciate." And Master said, well, you didn't renounce anything. Life, basically lost his job, lost his wife, life renounced you. and so we may renounce anger, but it doesn't mean anger has renounced us. And so it hangs on. And our best of intentions find that sometimes in the deep subconscious mind, it's resting there, waiting for the right circumstances. But of course, it's like all of these things. If you fill that glass enough, with the muddy particles, we'll get less and less and less, but it's hard to get that last little particle out of there, because and I think it comes to the point where you get rid of anger, but do you get rid of the potential for anger? You see, that potential for anger lasts until you're able to really get rid of the ego entirely. And that's going to take an element of God's grace, Guru's grace, to be able to. You can't do it all yourself. It's like cannot get rid of the ego by yourself. It's like me trying to pick myself up off the floor here. If I could put ropes around my feet and lift very hard, but I'm not going to get myself off the floor that way. Something else is required for me to tie my rope to something up here. And then maybe my efforts, but I think it's also going to take the efforts of somebody pulling me up as well. And so you have to there's an element of grace comes in, but we have to do our utmost at first, because in our efforts to overcome anger. We summon that grace through our recognition of our failure. Our heart is calling for help at some point, and so it does take more than us, and that's why we have to attune ourselves. That's tradition. It says why it's necessary to also have that presence of the great ones in our life, gurus and saints and sages. So, yes, ma'am.
How do you practice being samadhi affirming and not world renouncing on a day-to-day basis?
How do we practice what?
Samadhi affirming.
He used that term. Yes, samadhi affirming.
And not world renouncing.
And not worldly renouncing. I think honestly you do need a little of both. In other words, you do need worldly renouncing if you were to say, I know it sounds, I don't like the word sounding there, but it's like Ramakrishna said, when you start out, you plant the little tree, you have to put a fence around that tree. In other words, or else the animals will just trample it. But when that tree gets bigger, it doesn't need that fence, and it can actually, the fence can actually constrict the tree after a certain point. So you have to have a little bit of both. Common sense on the one hand, because we all know that environment is stronger than willpower, and so we have to. But what we can do is we can choose our environment. So we use the principles and use our common sense that way, but where is our attention pointing? And so that we have to be pointing toward the affirming side and realizing that we make progress, but okay, I'm gonna, I've got this anchor a little bit around my ankle, and we have to be untying that. But at the same time, we have to be moving in this direction. So it's never going to be totally one or the other, as long as we're bound in this world. But we have to look, where is our emphasis going to be, and where am I pointing, and what am I looking toward, but not be stupid about it. we have to recognize worldly realities, but dispassionately. I think that's the thing. Sometimes people, they're not dispassionate, and in other words, they get emotionally feelings of guilt. That's not right. Fear. That's not right. All of these negative type things are unhelpful. So I'm saying be dispassionate and commonsensical, without the heart, being disturbed by it, you see, but being open, clear-minded, and open-eyed, but moving in that direction. Yes, ma'am.
Can we be like Rabia Basri, just totally full of love, kindness for the creation around? Then do we need the techniques?
Well, Yogananda knew a fellow who was a great bhakti. And that bhakti had been trying, and it was a good soul, good high soul, bhakti soul. And Yogananda came to him and offered him, he says, why don't I'd like to offer you something, give him a technique. He wanted to give him Kriya. And he says, this will help you in your bhakti, in your love for God, this will help you. And the man said, no, that's not my path. My path, I want to be true to my path, I'll be loyal to my path. So no, I don't want to do that. And so he kept trying, but he kept resisting. But finally, then Master told him, he says, yes, but for 20 years, you have been in like a man in a locked room, darkened room, trying to find the door to get out, or the light switch to turn the switch on. You can't find it. Why don't I help you with this? This will help you. And so finally the man agreed, and he practiced Kriya for some short time, and basically he went into a state of samadhi. And his love, the love of his heart was fulfilled through that use of that technique. So, was it the technique? Or was it the love of his heart that was there in the first place? One without the other in that case was there. But so I think you might interpret that also to mean the love of his heart had gotten so strong that he drew to him the advice of somebody of the quality of Paramhansa Yogananda to him to then offer him something. And the man says, no, I don't. And at first he was saying, I don't want your offering. I love God. But it was God coming to him to give that person what he needed. So he was sort of saying, oh, it's different. But it was God who he was loving. Was, oh gosh, I can't remember what the story is, that the fellow he goes to, he prays to God. Oh, God, I want to win the lottery. I want to win the lottery. And he goes, and day after day, he's winning the lottery. But he never wins. He never wins the lottery. So he goes to heaven, and God welcomes him to heaven. And he says, oh, my son, you've come finally. And he says, yes, Father. But why, why? I prayed and prayed, but I never won the lottery. Why didn't I win the lottery? God says, well, son, first thing you should have done was buy a ticket. So, maybe somewhere in there's an answer. So I think it's God comes to us in different ways, and why not use the help that God brings? So, any other question? Okay. No, thank you all very much for coming today. I very much enjoy. I shouldn't say that because No, because you see, I was going to say I very much enjoy talking to people that are Kriya bonds and people that I can kind of, you're going to be forgiving of me when I get out there and you're not thinking, oh, look, you said that and it contradicted that, which it probably did, but you understand the spiritual life is not black and white. There's a lot of gray area there, and you say this and at the same time that, could have been that. So with a little experience, you've got ability to discriminate in there. And that allows me the freedom, or others, to speak a little bit more casually. We're not looking at my words. But the reason I was saying I shouldn't say that, because I'm going to give another talk tomorrow, which is going to be more open to a general public, and that sort of implies I'm not going to enjoy that, which is not true. Anyway, so we're going to do another talk tomorrow on the topic of magnetism.
Ushering in the new year with
new magnetism?
Increased magnetism.
Increased magnetism. Now that's what he wants me to talk about. We'll see what happens. And anyway, that's suddenly I've taken up all the time. But if you want to say anything, anyway, if you wanted to offer anything, you're welcome. But anyway, thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, Jaya.
Thank you.